My husband's voice, usually a soothing balm, shattered our peaceful Thanksgiving like a dropped heirloom. "I'm selling the house," Richard declared, his gaze sweeping past me to our stunned children, for Bethany and her 3 little ones. The words tasted like ash, leaving me breathless in a silent room of shock. The scent of roasted turkey and warm apple pie usually filled our home with comfort, a blanket woven from 2 decades of shared Thanksgivings. This year, it felt like a fragile veil, easily torn. I'd risen before dawn, my hands moving with practiced grace through the motions of a feast I'd prepared countless times. The hum of the refrigerator, the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, these were the familiar rhythms of my life with Richard. Yet, beneath this comforting facade, a discordant note had been playing for months, growing louder with each passing week. I remember watching the cranberry sauce simmer, its jewel-toned surface bubbling gently, when Richard's phone buzzed for the 8th time that morning. He stood in the kitchen doorway, ostensibly admiring my handiwork, but his eyes were fixed on the screen, a private smile playing on his lips, a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in what felt like forever. "Honey, could you lend a hand with the turkey?" I'd called out, wrestling with the colossal bird that threatened to slide from my grasp. The 20-pound weight felt symbolic, a burden I was increasingly carrying alone. In a minute, he'd mumbled, his thumbs dancing across the glass. I lifted the heavy roasting pan myself, the familiar ache in my lower back a stark reminder that my 49 years were etched not just on my face, but in the very core of my being. My husband, the man I'd built a life with, couldn't spare a moment from his digital world for the meal I'd spent a week planning, but I swallowed the sting, the familiar tide of irritation rising then receding. Today was about family. Our son, Marcus, had driven all the way from Boston, his usually bright eyes shadowed with fatigue from his demanding tech job, but his presence was a balm. Our daughter, Olivia, arrived in a whirlwind of laughter and stories from her graduate program, her arms laden with expensive wine bottles. Seeing them both at our polished mahogany table, their easy banter filling the air, momentarily made every hour of preparation worthwhile. My grandmother's delicate china, with its intricate blue floral pattern, gleamed under the soft glow of the dining room chandelier. The centerpiece, a lavish cornucopia spilling forth with miniature gourds, vibrant autumn leaves, and battery-operated candles that flickered like real flames, was a testament to hours of careful arrangement. Richard had walked past it 3 times without a single comment. "Mom, this chestnut stuffing is divine," Marcus praised, reaching for a second generous helping. "Did you finally perfect Grandma Evelyn's secret recipe?" I smiled, watching his boyish enthusiasm, a stark contrast to the distant man sitting beside him. "A few secret ingredients this year, darling. Dried figs and a hint of smoky paprika." Olivia, her cheeks flushed from the Cabernet Sauvignon, raised her glass. "To Eleanor, for yet another Thanksgiving miracle." We clinked glasses, the crystal chime echoing in the suddenly quiet room, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt as it should be. This was the warmth, the connection, the sense of belonging I'd yearned for, the vision that had kept me going through the early morning hours of preparation. Then Richard's phone vibrated again. His casual glance morphed into a flicker of something unreadable, a secret held tightly behind his eyes. "Everything all right, Dad?" Olivia asked, her gaze sharp, missing nothing. "Just fine," he said too quickly, shoving the phone into his jacket pocket. But his leg bounced relentlessly under the table, a telltale sign I knew all too well. I'd been married to Richard for 25 years. I knew his subtle signals, the clearing of his throat before difficult conversations, the fleeting avoidance of eye contact when a truth was being withheld, the almost imperceptible straightening of his shoulders just before he delivered a pronouncement he considered profound. He was doing all 3 right now. "Actually," Richard began, pushing his chair back with an abrupt scrape that jarred the peaceful silence, the sound slicing through our conversation like a cold knife. Marcus and Olivia looked up, their forks suspended midair. He cleared his throat again, a nervous habit. "I have something important to share with everyone." His voice adopted a forced casualness, the kind he used in business meetings when he had rehearsed a difficult announcement. My stomach plummeted, a heavy stone dropping into an abyss. "Richard," I said softly, my voice a quiet counterpoint to the sudden tension. "Can't this wait until after we've had pie?" He didn't even glance at me. His gaze was fixed on some distant point, as if addressing an unseen board of directors rather than his own family. I'm selling the house. The words struck the table like a physical blow, reverberating through the heavy silence. Olivia's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Marcus's fork clattered against his plate, the metallic sound jarring. What? Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. But Richard wasn't finished. Bethany and her children need a place with more space. Little Chloe is just 4, and the boys, 5 and 7, are growing so fast. Her apartment is simply too small for their needs. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the frantic pounding of my own heart in my ears. Bethany. He'd spoken her name in our dining room, at our Thanksgiving table, in front of our children. The woman whose existence I had, for months, been pretending not to acknowledge. Marcus's face had gone utterly pale, his jaw tightening. Dad, what on earth are you talking about? Bethany is my fiancée, Richard continued, his tone alarmingly dispassionate, as if discussing the weather. We've been together for nearly 10 months now. She has 3 wonderful children from her previous marriage, and they deserve stability. A real home. Olivia made a choked sound, like she'd been punched in the gut. Fiancé? I sat perfectly still, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, watching my children's faces crumple, their youthful joy evaporating like mist. This was how he chose to tell them. Not privately, not gently, not with an ounce of consideration for their tender feelings. It was a business transaction, cold and calculated. The market is hot right now, Richard droned on, oblivious to the devastation he was wreaking. The house will sell quickly. Bethany found a charming place in Willow Creek with a sprawling backyard and excellent schools. 5 bedrooms, 3 baths. The kids will absolutely adore it. What about us? Olivia's voice was a fragile whisper. What about Mom? Finally, Richard's eyes met mine. There was a flicker of something almost defiant in his gaze, as if he expected me to erupt, to cry or scream, to give him an excuse to paint me as the hysterical wife incapable of handling his newfound happiness. Instead, I stood slowly, my movements deliberate and calm. I walked to my purse, resting on the kitchen counter, my hand steady as I retrieved the cream-colored envelope I'd been carrying for 3 weeks, waiting for this precise moment. Or perhaps, waiting for the worst possible moment, which, it seemed, was now. I returned to the table and gently placed the envelope beside his plate, right on top of a gravy stain he'd made during his little speech. Since you're making announcements, I said quietly, meeting his eyes for the first time all day, a calm strength hardening my voice. Then I sat back down, picked up my fork, and took a deliberate bite of my sweet potato casserole. It tasted like ash, but I chewed it anyway, maintaining eye contact with the man who had just dismantled our family's Thanksgiving with the casual cruelty of someone reading a grocery list. The envelope sat between us, a silent weapon, and for the first time since he'd begun his devastating monologue, Richard looked utterly uncertain. His fingers hovered over the pristine envelope as if it might bite him. The competent businessman who had just announced the sale of our family home had vanished, replaced by a man who looked genuinely afraid. His hand trembled as he picked it up, feeling its unexpected weight. What is it, Dad? Marcus's voice cut through the thick tension, but his eyes never left his father's face. There was a new hardness in my son's expression, a raw disillusionment I'd never seen before. The man he'd looked up to his entire life had just revealed himself to be a stranger. Richard turned the envelope over, examining the seal. I had written his name in my careful cursive, the same elegant handwriting that had graced birthday cards and anniversary notes for over 2 decades. But this felt different. Final. Eleanor, what? He started, but the words withered in his throat when he looked at me. My expression remained neutral, almost serene. Let him wonder. Let him sweat. Olivia was studying both of us, her wine glass forgotten in her hand. Mom, are you okay? Her voice was small, vulnerable, still reeling from her father's bombshell, trying to comprehend how her world had just tilted on its axis. I reached across the table and squeezed her free hand. I'm perfectly fine, sweetheart. And surprisingly, I was. For the first time in months, I felt completely in control. Richard slipped the unopened envelope into his jacket pocket. The relief on his face was almost comical, as if postponing the inevitable would somehow make it disappear. But I could see the curiosity gnawing at him, the way his hand kept drifting back to his pocket. Aren't you going to open it? Marcus asked, his tone carrying an edge that made Richard flinch. Later, Richard mumbled, reaching for his water glass, his throat clearly dry. The atmosphere around our once beautiful Thanksgiving table had shifted entirely. What had been warm family conversation was now stilted and profoundly uncomfortable. Olivia kept glancing between her father and me, trying to piece together a puzzle whose critical parts were missing. Marcus had stopped eating entirely, his jaw clenched tight. I, however, continued with my meal, savoring each bite. The turkey was perfectly moist, the stuffing had just the right amount of herbs, and the cranberry sauce achieved that exquisite balance of tart and sweet. All those hours of preparation hadn't been wasted. After all, this meal would certainly be memorable, so, I said conversationally, cutting another piece of turkey, my voice steady, how long has Bethany been helping you make decisions about our home? Richard's fork clattered against his plate once more. Eleanor, not now. When then? I asked, my voice still unnervingly calm. After you've packed my belongings? After you've changed the locks? Olivia's wine glass hit the table harder than she intended. You're really doing this, Dad? You're really abandoning Mom for some woman with children? It's complicated, Richard said, the classic response of a man who knew he was wrong but lacked the courage to admit it. No, Marcus said firmly, his voice laced with cold fury. It's really not complicated at all. Just then, Richard's phone started buzzing again. He glanced at the screen, and I saw her name flash across it, Bethany. Even now, even in the midst of destroying his family, she couldn't leave him alone for one single meal. The phone buzzed again, then a third time. Answer it, I said quietly, a faint smile touching my lips. Don't let us deter you from attending to your priorities. He declined the call, his face flushing a furious red. It's work. Olivia actually laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. On Thanksgiving? At 7 o'clock in the evening? The phone buzzed a fourth time, relentless. Richard's composure was cracking. He kept touching the pocket where the envelope lay hidden, his leg bouncing more frantically under the table. You know what? Marcus stood up abruptly, his napkin falling silently to the floor. I've lost my appetite. He looked at his father with such profound disappointment that even I felt the sting of it. 25 years of marriage, Dad. 25 years of what I believed was a happy family. And you announce your sordid affair at Thanksgiving dinner as if you're discussing quarterly earnings. Marcus, you don't understand, I understand perfectly. Marcus's voice was cold, controlled, precise. You decided your fleeting happiness was worth more than Mom's dignity, worth more than our family traditions, worth more than looking your children in the eye without lying. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus was already walking away. We heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, then the firm click of his childhood bedroom door closing. Olivia's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Daddy, she whispered, using the endearment she hadn't called him in years. How could you do this to us? For a fleeting moment, Richard's mask slipped completely. I saw regret flicker across his features, a genuine flicker of pain at hurting his daughter. But then his phone buzzed again, and the moment was gone. This time, he answered it. I can't talk right now, he said in a low, strained voice, turning away from the table. But Olivia and I could hear Bethany's voice through the speaker, sharp and demanding, an angry wasp. We couldn't make out the exact words, but the tone was unmistakable. She wasn't happy about being ignored. I said, I can't talk, Richard repeated, his voice tight with desperation. He ended the call and immediately turned his phone face down on the table, silencing it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Olivia was staring at her father as if seeing him for the very first time, a stranger in their midst. I continued eating, allowing the quiet to stretch between us, knowing that sometimes silence spoke more eloquently than words ever could. Finally, Olivia spoke. "I think I need some air." She stood up carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Mom, would you like help clearing the table?" "That's quite all right, sweetheart. Go get some fresh air." After she left, it was just Richard and me, sitting across from each other at the table where we'd shared countless meals, celebrated birthdays, helped our children with homework, and planned our future together. "The envelope in his pocket might as well have been a ticking bomb, Eleanor," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "We need to talk." I looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time in months. When had he become so utterly a stranger? When had the man I'd loved enough to build an entire life with transformed into someone who could devastate his family over dessert? "No," I said simply, standing and beginning to stack the plates. "We really don't." That night, I went to bed early and quietly locked the bedroom door behind me. I could hear Richard pacing downstairs, the floorboards groaning under his anxious weight, probably trying to work up the courage to open the envelope. Let him pace. Let him wonder. I slept more soundly than I had in months. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke to an empty house. Richard had left before dawn, probably to avoid facing the envelope, still burning a metaphorical hole in whatever pocket he'd shoved it into. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen, watching the steam curl lazily from my mug as memories I'd been suppressing for months finally surfaced. It had all begun in March, such an ordinary Tuesday, when the unraveling quietly started, though I was oblivious then. Richard came home 3 hours late, his collar subtly wrinkled, claiming an urgent client meeting had run over. I'd heated his dinner, asked about his day, listened to his tired responses, the perfect, trusting wife. But something felt undeniably off. Small things, tiny fractures in our routine, which I rationalized away because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. The late nights became a consistent pattern. "Big presentation tomorrow," he'd say, grabbing his laptop bag, his voice already distant. "Don't wait up." I'd lie in bed, listening intently for his car, checking the clock as midnight bled into 2 a.m. When I dared to ask, he'd sigh heavily, making me feel guilty for questioning his dedication. April brought a cascade of cancelled plans, our anniversary dinner, theater tickets. Each disappointment came wrapped in elaborate apologies and fervent promises to make it up to me later. Later, of course, never arrived. Bethany Marshall first appeared as a casual name in conversation. "Bethany from accounting thinks," Bethany suggested, "just another colleague." Then I started seeing her on his phone. A group shot from an office party I'd missed. Bethany was blonde, petite, standing just close enough to Richard to snag my attention. She possessed that bright, unlined face that spoke of someone at least a decade younger than my 49 years, but it was the second photo that sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Richard and Bethany, at a cozy coffee shop. Her 3 young children clustered around them. She was laughing, her hand resting casually on his arm, while a little girl with bouncy pigtails sat on his lap. I found it by accident, scrolling through his phone. The photo was dated 2 weeks earlier, on a Saturday when Richard had claimed to be playing golf. "Who are these children?" I asked that night, showing him the screen, my voice calm. Richard barely glanced at the phone before launching into his well-rehearsed response. "Oh, that's Bethany from work. She's going through a messy divorce. Those are her kids. Cute, right? Poor things are really struggling." The explanation was smooth, practiced. But I noticed how he snatched his phone back immediately, how his thumb moved instinctively to delete the photo. "You're helping her with her divorce?" I pressed gently. "Someone has to." His tone carried that familiar edge of righteousness. "She doesn't have many friends, Eleanor." I wanted to believe him desperately, so I pushed down the sick feeling in my stomach and chose trust over suspicion, but the phone call started getting harder to ignore. Bethany's name illuminated his screen during dinner, during our morning coffee, even during Marcus's graduation ceremony. Richard would glance at it, frown, and let it go to voicemail. "She's having a rough time," he'd explain, "probably needs advice about the custody battle." The custody battle that, as I would later discover, didn't exist because Bethany had been divorced for 3 years. One sweltering evening in July, Olivia called. She casually mentioned seeing her father at the park near her apartment. He was with some woman and her kids, Olivia said. Playing on the swings, looked like a real family outing. I almost went over to say hi, but they seemed intimate. My hands went cold. What did the woman look like? Blonde, pretty, younger than you. The kids were adorable. Dad was pushing the girl on the swing, and she was giggling like crazy. It was actually really sweet. Olivia paused. Mom, is everything truly okay between you and Dad? I lied smoothly. Everything's absolutely fine, sweetheart. Dad probably just ran into his coworker and her kids. But after I hung up, I sat in the darkened living room for hours. Pieces of a puzzle I'd been refusing to see finally clicked into place. My husband, playing happy family with another woman's children, while I sat at home, wondering where our 25-year marriage had gone so horribly wrong. That's when I stopped fighting for his attention and, instead, started paying close attention. I listened when he talked, noting inconsistencies. I watched his face when his phone rang. I began to quietly document the changes in our finances, unexplained withdrawals, credit card charges from restaurants I'd never visited, mysterious cash purchases. The word downsizing first surfaced in September. Richard mentioned it casually over breakfast. The housing market's pretty hot right now, he said, not looking up from his tablet. Might be smart to think about downsizing while we can still get top dollar for this place. I knew then, from the way he avoided my eyes, the careful casualness of his tone, the impeccable timing of it all. He wasn't planning to downsize with me. He was meticulously planning to upsize with someone else. But Richard, in all his careful deception, had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed I would remain the passive, trusting wife who swallowed every lie. He had no idea that I had already made an appointment with Mr. Sterling, the most astute divorce attorney in the state. Mr. Sterling's office smelled of rich leather and expensive cologne. I sat across from his gleaming mahogany desk, my hands folded calmly, watching him review the folder I had painstakingly compiled, bank statements, credit card bills, photographs printed from Bethany's social media. Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Sterling said, are you absolutely certain you wish to proceed in this manner? I nodded, my voice steady. I need to protect myself and my children. My husband believes I am naive. I prefer to keep him believing that until I am ready. What I hadn't initially told Mr. Sterling was how I had discovered Bethany's social media. Olivia had innocently mentioned seeing posts from Dad's coworker, which led me to search for her online. What I found made my coffee go cold. Bethany wasn't merely posting family photos. She was meticulously crafting a narrative, pictures of her children at parks I recognized, restaurants Richard had mentioned, even the ice cream parlor he'd taken our children to. But it was the captions that truly twisted the knife, everyday adventures with my favorite people, under a photo of her daughter on the same swing set where Richard had pushed Olivia. Teaching them that new beginnings can be beautiful, beneath a photo of her boys, posted the same weekend Richard had claimed a work retreat. In the background, unmistakably, was Richard's distinctive blue polo shirt. The most devastating post had arrived in October. A cozy dinner scene at Bethany's apartment. Candles flickering. Her children in matching pajamas surrounding a man whose face was carefully cropped out. The caption read, "So grateful for the man who shows my babies what real love looks like." Some people just come into your life and make you realize what you've been missing. I had sat staring at my laptop screen until my eyes burned, wondering how many of these people knew that her someone special was a married man, but it was the financial evidence that truly revealed the shocking scope of Richard's deception. While our own credit cards maxed out and household bills piled up unpaid, mysterious charges appeared on statements I'd never seen before. A joint account I discovered purely by accident when mail was delivered to our address for Mr. and Mrs. R. Holloway, except the Mrs. wasn't me. I'd opened that envelope with shaking hands, finding statements for a credit card I'd never signed for, issued in both Richard's name and Bethany Marshall's. The charges painted a vivid picture of domestic bliss, grocery stores, toy stores, children's clothing retailers. $600 at Little Dreamers Furniture, $400 at Princess Palace Boutique. Meanwhile, our mortgage payment had been late twice, and I'd had to use my own savings to cover the electric bill. The most painful discovery came when I found receipts in Richard's jacket pocket. Everyday purchases from the local pharmacy. But the items told a story that shattered my heart. Children's Tylenol, character band-aids, bedtime storybooks, even a receipt for a birthday cake with Happy 4th Birthday Chloe written in pink frosting. He was living a complete father's life with Bethany's children, while his own adult children wondered why he seemed so distant. I started documenting everything: screenshots, financial statements, photographs of receipts. Not to hurt him, but because Mr. Sterling had warned me that men like Richard often attempted to rewrite history during divorce proceedings. He'll claim the money was for legitimate business expenses, Mr. Sterling had explained. He'll say the social media posts are misunderstood. Men in his position are very good at controlling narratives. I kept everything meticulously stored in a safety deposit box across town. Every Friday, I'd make my weekly deposits, adding new, damning evidence. It felt like preparing for war. The breaking point arrived on our 25th wedding anniversary, October 15th. I'd made reservations at the Gilded Spoon 6 weeks in advance. At 6 o'clock, I was standing by the front door, elegant in my heels and coat. Richard's call came at 6:15. "Eleanor, I am so incredibly sorry, but Bethany's having an emergency." A complete breakdown about the custody situation. "I simply can't leave her alone with the kids. Can we postpone?" I stood in our entryway, looking at myself in the mirror, dressed up with nowhere to go, married to a man who was somewhere else, playing hero to another woman's crisis. "Of course," I'd said, my voice calm as polished glass. "Family emergencies always come first." After I hung up, I didn't change out of my dress. Instead, I drove to the Gilded Spoon alone, sat at our table for two, and slowly enjoyed the most expensive bottle of Chardonnay on the menu. That night, I called Mr. Sterling from my car. "It's time," I said simply. The next morning, while Richard slept in, I met with Mr. Sterling and his team. We spent 4 hours meticulously mapping out a strategy. "The element of surprise is your greatest advantage," Mr. Sterling had emphasized. "Men like your husband operate from a position of assumed control. They make plans based on the belief that their wives will remain passive and predictable." But I was done being predictable. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after he had so carelessly destroyed our family Thanksgiving, I was making blueberry pancakes when Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway, the cream-colored envelope clutched in his trembling hands. His hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "What is this?" I flipped a pancake with practiced ease, not turning around. "Open it and find out." The sound of tearing paper filled the kitchen. Then came the silence, long, terrible, absolute silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. You transferred the deed." I turned around slowly, meeting his eyes. His face had gone completely white, and his hands were shaking so badly the papers rattled. "3 months ago," I said conversationally. "Amazing how much paperwork goes unread when you're busy playing house with someone else's family. You set me up." The words came out as a hiss, full of rage and disbelief. "You planned this whole thing." I took a sip of my coffee. "I protected myself." "There's a difference." "The house," he started, "Bethany's expecting." "We've been planning. Bethany is expecting a house that was never yours to give." I set down my mug. "Funny how that works, isn't it?" Richard's phone started ringing then. Bethany's name flashed across the screen, and I watched the last bit of color drain from his face. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice falsely cheerful. "Hey, babe." Bethany's voice was sharp enough that I could hear every word. "Richard, I've been thinking about the timeline for the house sale. The kids are so excited about their new bedrooms. When do you think we'll have the paperwork signed?" Richard's eyes met mine. I smiled sweetly. "Actually, Bethany, there's been a bit of a complication." The silence on the other end was deafening. What kind of complication? It turns out the house isn't technically in my name anymore. What do you mean it's not in your name? It's your house. Richard looked at me helplessly. I turned back to my pancakes. Eleanor transferred the deed, he said finally, without telling me. I found out today. The explosion that followed was spectacular. Bethany's voice reached a pitch that probably shattered crystal somewhere. Words like betrayed and manipulated and lying snake filled the kitchen. So, let me get this straight, Bethany was saying when her voice finally dropped. You promised me and my children a home that you never actually owned? You made me believe we had a future when you were just another cheating husband? Bethany, please, don't you dare, Bethany, please, me. I've wasted 10 months of my life on a man who can't even secure a roof over our heads. The line went dead. Richard stared at his phone like it had bitten him. She hung up. Shocking, I said dryly. Who could have predicted that a woman looking for financial security might lose interest when the money disappears? His phone buzzed with text messages. 25 years, he said suddenly, his voice cracking. 25 years of marriage, and you destroy it all with paperwork. I turned to face him fully, and for the first time I let my simmering anger show. I destroyed it? I destroyed our marriage? I set my spatula down with enough force to make him flinch. You stood in our dining room, in front of our children, and announced your plans to sell our home for your girlfriend's convenience. But somehow I'm the one who destroyed our marriage? My voice came out sharp as broken glass. Between your late nights, your emergency phone calls from Bethany, your lies about golf, and your secret credit cards, exactly when was I supposed to have this conversation with the stranger wearing my husband's face? Richard tried calling Marcus and Olivia that afternoon. I watched him pace, leaving voicemails that went unanswered. When Marcus finally picked up, their conversation lasted precisely 30 seconds. We're standing with Mom, Marcus said. You made your choice at Thanksgiving dinner. We've made ours. Olivia's response was even shorter. Don't call me again until you're ready to apologize to Mom. And I mean, really apologize. By Saturday, I was hosting my book club brunch in the kitchen Richard had once planned to hand over to Bethany. 8 wonderful women gathered around the island. The laughter that filled the space felt different than it had in months. Lighter. Freer. My dear Eleanor, you seem so incredibly relaxed lately, my friend Margaret commented. You're practically glowing. I looked around at the women who had been my steadfast friends for years, sitting in the home I'd protected. I feel like I've finally stopped holding my breath, I said. And for the first time in months, that was profoundly, wonderfully true. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday in February. I signed for them with steady hands, noting that Richard had filed first, his final, desperate attempt to control a narrative that had already slipped through his fingers. Mr. Sterling had warned me this would happen. Let him file. Let him think he's taking charge. Meanwhile, we'll be 3 steps ahead with our countersuit. I set the papers on my counter without even opening them. I had a life to rebuild, and surprisingly, it felt lighter with each passing day. Mr. Sterling had become more than just my astute attorney. He had become a trusted friend whose wisdom extended far beyond legal strategy. Our professional relationship had concluded 8 months ago, but we still met occasionally for coffee. He'd never remarried after his own divorce 15 years earlier, and while neither of us had yet overtly broached the subject of anything beyond friendship, there was an undeniable ease between us, a shared understanding that felt increasingly like possibility. Richard's story had taken a starkly different trajectory. He'd lost his job 3 months after the wedding debacle. His desperate attempts to rebuild with Bethany had failed spectacularly when she'd abruptly moved to Arizona with her children and a brand new boyfriend. I'd heard through Marcus that Richard was now working as a freelance consultant, living in a modest studio apartment, and driving a 10-year-old sedan. The man who had once commanded boardrooms was now learning what it truly meant to start over at 52, with nothing but his pride, and even that, I suspected, was significantly damaged goods. But the most surprising development had come just last month. Richard had called me directly for the first time since the divorce. His voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I had ever heard it. Eleanor, he'd said, I know I have absolutely no right to ask anything of you, but I need to know. Will you be at Marcus's engagement party? Of course, I will. He's my son. I want to come, too, he'd continued, but I won't if it makes you uncomfortable. I know I've lost the right to claim space in our children's celebrations, but I'd like to try to rebuild some kind of relationship with them, if that's even possible. I'd sat in my kitchen, considering my response. The woman I had been a year ago might have seized this opportunity to deliver one final, crushing blow. But the woman I had become understood that my peace no longer required his continued suffering. Richard, I'd said finally. Marcus and Olivia are adults. Their relationships with you are entirely their choice to make. But I won't be the reason you can't try to repair what you broke with them. The engagement party arrived with perfect October weather. I chose a navy dress that made me feel confident without trying too hard, paired it with the delicate pearl earrings my mother had given me, and drove to the country club with the windows down and my favorite music playing softly. Marcus looked absolutely radiant in his charcoal suit, Sarah glowing beautifully beside him. They moved through the joyous crowd like people who genuinely relished each other's company. Richard arrived halfway through the cocktail hour, looking uncertain and small as he stood in the doorway. He'd lost a noticeable amount of weight, and his hair had more silver than I remembered. When Marcus spotted him, I watched my son's face intently. What I saw surprised me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something softer, more nuanced than the raw anger. Marcus approached his father with Sarah at his side, and they talked quietly for several minutes before Marcus formally introduced Sarah. Olivia joined them a few minutes later, and I watched from across the room as my children made their own difficult choices about redemption and second chances. They were gracious, but not effusive, polite, but not warm. Richard would have to earn his way back into their lives, one conversation at a time, and there were no guarantees he would succeed. As the evening gracefully wound down, I found myself standing on the terrace, overlooking the sprawling golf course where Richard had once spent his Saturday mornings. The profound irony was not lost on me. I was claiming space in a world he'd once dominated, while he stood inside, humbly trying to rebuild fragile bridges he'd burned for someone who had never truly known him at all. Mr. Sterling appeared beside me with 2 glasses of chilled champagne. How are you holding up, Eleanor? I accepted the glass, considering the question seriously. Better than fine, actually. Good. Really, genuinely good. He smiled. You've earned it. Looking back at the lively party through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Marcus and Sarah cutting their engagement cake while Olivia took countless pictures. Richard stood slightly apart, uncertain of his place, but visibly grateful to be included at all. This was my new life. Not perfect, certainly, but honest. Not without its challenges, but built on a foundation of my own choosing. I had learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, but reconstruction. Not tearing down the person who hurt you, but meticulously building something infinitely better, stronger, and more beautiful from the shattered pieces they left behind. The woman who had sat at that Thanksgiving table 11 months ago had been terrified of losing everything. The woman standing on this terrace had discovered that sometimes, losing everything is just another way of saying you are finally free to choose what comes next. And what came next felt like possibility, stretching out as far as the horizon, bright with promise, and entirely, wonderfully my own. If this story of quiet strength, devastating betrayal, and triumphant rebirth resonated with you, if you've ever felt the sting of being overlooked or the fire of fighting for your own worth, press that like button right now. My favorite moment was when Eleanor calmly handed Richard that unassuming envelope at Thanksgiving dinner, knowing precisely what life-altering bombshell was nestled inside. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't let your voice go unheard. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story of resilience, justice, and finding your own incredible future. Share this with a woman who needs a reminder of her own power. Mr. Sterling had become more than just my astute attorney. He had become a trusted friend whose wisdom extended far beyond legal strategy. Our professional relationship had concluded 8 months ago, but we still met occasionally for coffee. He'd never remarried after his own divorce 15 years earlier, and while neither of us had yet overtly broached the subject of anything beyond friendship, there was an undeniable ease between us, a shared understanding that felt increasingly like possibility. Richard's story had taken a starkly different trajectory. He'd lost his job 3 months after the wedding debacle. His desperate attempts to rebuild with Bethany had failed spectacularly when she'd abruptly moved to Arizona with her children and a brand new boyfriend. I'd heard through Marcus that Richard was now working as a freelance consultant, living in a modest studio apartment, and driving a 10-year-old sedan. The man who had once commanded boardrooms was now learning what it truly meant to start over at 52, with nothing but his pride, and even that, I suspected, was significantly damaged goods. But the most surprising development had come just last month. Richard had called me directly for the first time since the divorce. His voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I had ever heard it. "Eleanor," he'd said, "I know I have absolutely no right to ask anything of you, but I need to know. Will you be at Marcus's engagement party?" "Of course, I will. He's my son." "I want to come, too," he'd continued, "but I won't if it makes you uncomfortable. I know I've lost the right to claim space in our children's celebrations, but I'd like to try to rebuild some kind of relationship with them, if that's even possible." I'd sat in my kitchen, considering my response. The woman I had been a year ago might have seized this opportunity to deliver one final, crushing blow. But the woman I had become understood that my peace no longer required his continued suffering. "Richard," I'd said finally. "Marcus and Olivia are adults. Their relationships with you are entirely their choice to make. But I won't be the reason you can't try to repair what you broke with them." The engagement party arrived with perfect October weather. I chose a navy dress that made me feel confident without trying too hard, paired it with the delicate pearl earrings my mother had given me, and drove to the country club with the windows down and my favorite music playing softly. Marcus looked absolutely radiant in his charcoal suit, Sarah glowing beautifully beside him. They moved through the joyous crowd like people who genuinely relished each other's company. Richard arrived halfway through the cocktail hour, looking uncertain and small as he stood in the doorway. He'd lost a noticeable amount of weight, and his hair had more silver than I remembered. When Marcus spotted him, I watched my son's face intently. What I saw surprised me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something softer, more nuanced than the raw anger. Marcus approached his father with Sarah at his side, and they talked quietly for several minutes before Marcus formally introduced Sarah. Olivia joined them a few minutes later, and I watched from across the room as my children made their own difficult choices about redemption and second chances. They were gracious, but not effusive, polite, but not warm. Richard would have to earn his way back into their lives, one conversation at a time, and there were no guarantees he would succeed. As the evening gracefully wound down, I found myself standing on the terrace, overlooking the sprawling golf course where Richard had once spent his Saturday mornings. The profound irony was not lost on me. I was claiming space in a world he'd once dominated, while he stood inside, humbly trying to rebuild fragile bridges he'd burned for someone who had never truly known him at all. Mr. Sterling appeared beside me with 2 glasses of chilled champagne. "How are you holding up, Eleanor?" I accepted the glass, considering the question seriously. "Better than fine, actually." "Good. Really, genuinely good." He smiled. "You've earned it." Looking back at the lively party through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Marcus and Sarah cutting their engagement cake while Olivia took countless pictures. Richard stood slightly apart, uncertain of his place, but visibly grateful to be included at all. This was my new life. Not perfect, certainly, but honest. Not without its challenges, but built on a foundation of my own choosing. I had learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, but reconstruction. Not tearing down the person who hurt you, but meticulously building something infinitely better, stronger, and more beautiful from the shattered pieces they left behind. The woman who had sat at that Thanksgiving table 11 months ago had been terrified of losing everything. The woman standing on this terrace had discovered that sometimes, Losing everything is just another way of saying you are finally free to choose what comes next. And what came next felt like possibility, stretching out as far as the horizon, bright with promise, and entirely, wonderfully my own. If this story of quiet strength, devastating betrayal, and triumphant rebirth resonated with you, if you've ever felt the sting of being overlooked or the fire of fighting for your own worth, press that like button right now. My favorite moment was when Eleanor calmly handed Richard that unassuming envelope at Thanksgiving dinner, knowing precisely what life-altering bombshell was nestled inside. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't let your voice go unheard. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story of resilience, justice, and finding your own incredible future. Share this with a woman who needs a reminder of her own power.